So our second snippet for this week looks at, I think, probably the most triumphant aspect of the Bush administration's foreign policy, which was the handling of the Gulf War in the Middle East in 1990-91, and probably his greatest failure in foreign affairs, which was his handling of the collapse of Yugoslavia. So the situation in the Gulf. This is Saddam Hussein, the longtime dictator of Iraq. Saddam had fought a brutal war with Iran from 1980 through 1988. Both sides commit war crimes in this conflict. Saddam initiates the war. The war is financed increasingly by Sunni Arab states in the Gulf, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and especially Saudi Arabia, who fear, not unreasonably, fear Iranian expansion and see Iraq as a buffer state to stop the Iranians. In the aftermath of the war, which ends in 1988, Saddam goes to these Sunni states and says, look, I was basically fighting your fight too. You should forgive these loans to my government. And the Saudis and their allies say, thanks, but no thanks, and insist on the repayment of the loans. Secondly, Saddam becomes obsessed, in particular with Kuwait, the small oil-rich country to his south. Especially reports that the Kuwaitis had developed technology to. This is one of the major oil fields on the border. It's only a tiny portion of the oil was actually in Kuwaiti territory, but the Kuwaitis had developed technology to sort of reach into Iraq and pull out some of Iraq's oil as their own. Saddam pushes the Kuwaitis to do something about this. The Kuwait government says it's sort of out of our control. In the spring of 1990, there were increasingly belligerent threats coming from Iraq about the situation in Kuwait. The U.S. ambassador in Iraq, who was a senior civil servant, that is, she was not a political appointee of Bush. She was just someone in the diplomatic corps, and frequently some ambassadors are they're not all ambassadors are political appointees. She meets with Saddam. She's quite accommodationist of Saddam. She eventually will get removed as ambassador, and she suggests, or she seems to suggest, that the United States is not terribly concerned with the fate of Kuwait. At least these are the allegations in the aftermath of the invasion. So in August of 1990, Iraq puts troops on the border and marches into Kuwait, and very, very quickly occupies it. At that point, Saddam almost certainly could have just kept marching into Saudi Arabia and taken control of Saudi Arabia's oil fields as well. He doesn't do so, in large part because he expected that the other Arab states would simply accept his conquest of Kuwait as a fait accompli, that is, that they would not resist it. Whereas that would never happen, he understood, if he also invaded Saudi Arabia. But this winds up not happening. And in some ways, he gets the worst of both worlds. He has control of Kuwait. If he had taken control of Saudi Arabia, that would have given him substantial leverage. But he doesn't have that. And the Saudis appeal to the West for support. Bush's first statement in the aftermath of the invasion is somewhat tempered. His second statement is much stronger in condemning Saddam, and very strong opposition to Saddam's operation comes from the British Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, who makes clear that the British will support the U.S. as far as they want to go in this. And over the next several months, Bush was he was someone who was very comfortable with diplomacy, and this really is a perfect task for Bush. What he wants to do is to do two things. He wants UN support for this operation, This photograph is on the right is Secretary of State James Baker shaking the hands of Edvard Shevardnadze, who was the last reformist foreign minister of the Soviet Union. So this is 1990. The Soviet Union is still around at this point. The Soviets agree, even though they previously had been a patron of Iraq, the Soviets agree that they will not veto any UN resolution demanding Iraq withdraw from Kuwait. And similarly, in China, there had been a crisis in U.S.-Chinese relations in 1989 when the Chinese repress pro-democracy protesters in Beijing. This is called the Tiananmen Square massacre. And the U.S., the Bush administration's response to this is to condemn the Chinese, but not to impose sanctions or to cool their relations. And Bush's argument is, look, we care about human rights, but we care about other things as well. And so the Chinese also are willing to go along with. They won't support a UN resolution condemning the invasion, but they won't use their Security Council veto to stop the UN from addressing it as well. And maybe another president could have handled this really quite delicate diplomacy, but maybe not. And Bush is very well prepared for it. And then, secondly, the Bush administration attempts to rally strong support from the Arab world. What they understand correctly is that it's simply not going to be possible for an exclusively Western army to fight Saddam in Kuwait, that Saddam would be able to rally Arab support. But Bush is someone who personally had a long relationship with Middle East leaders for a variety of reasons, partially because of his service in the CIA, in particular, but also because in the 1950s he was an oil man in Texas, and so he was familiar with the world of Middle East oil. The Saudis trust him. They agree to his request to station U.S. troops on Saudi soil. And ultimately, he even gets support from Hafez al-Assad, the president for life of Syria, traditional anti-American figure. So it's a quite impressive coalition that Bush puts together. You can see it on this map. Any state country in color sends troops to the Middle East. And the striking thing to me about this map is that there's significant support from a variety of other Muslim states in the Middle East. It's only strongly and traditionally strongly anti-American countries in the region, Iran, Yemen, Algeria, Libya, that don't support the cause. Plus Lebanon and Jordan, which are essentially buffer states who are worried that if they participate in the war, the governments could collapse. But as you can sort of see from the map, Iraq is besieged by 1990. There is a last-ditch effort by the Iraqis. They go to Geneva. Saddam's government is convinced that the U.S. in the aftermath of Vietnam will be afraid to use troops. And when there is this last-ditch meeting in Geneva, Switzerland, the foreign minister of Iraq, Tariq Aziz, is convinced that this is going to be the U.S. coming in and saying, we want to find a way out of it. Instead, you can get a sense of the body language here from Secretary of State Baker is not exactly warm and fuzzy. At the meeting, Baker informs Aziz that if the Iraqis, as had been widely suspected they would, use chemical or biological weapons in the war against U.S. or coalition troops, the United States will use nuclear weapons against Iraq. It's the first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis where the use of nuclear weapons is seriously on the table, and it appears as if the Iraqis accepted the threat. They do not use the chemical and biological weapons that were in their possession. This is a map of the invasion plan, which is called Operation Desert Storm. The idea is to have significant bombing campaign to weaken Iraqi defenses, and then to have a large-scale invasion that would be not just of Kuwait, but would be deep into the desert, across into Iraq as well. And even though Iraq had a very, very large army, around 500,000 men, a lot of it was a conscription army. A lot of them were poorly trained. They were poorly equipped. They were no match for the coalition forces, and the war itself lasts only a few weeks. And then Bush has to make a final decision, which is a very controversial one. Um, Pre-war, the U.S. had used very belligerent rhetoric, including repeated comparisons of between Saddam Hussein and Adolf Hitler. Um, and and there was this sense that Saddam was just this sort of awful figure. And the expectation was that even though the stated cause of the war was the liberation of Kuwait, that coalition forces would also move into Baghdad and get rid of Saddam. But the Bush team didn't want to do this. What they worried about, and as we'll see with the second Gulf War, this is sort of what happens, and so their worries were prescient. What they worry about is that if the central government in Iraq is kicked out, the net result is not going to be a pro-democratic unified government, but the collapse of Iraq and the creation of a kind of failed state. So ultimately, instead, what the US does is allow Saddam to remain in power, but to create these things called no-fly zones. The northern no-fly zone, which is in Iraqi Kurdistan, and the southern no-fly zone, which is an area in southern Iraq, mostly populated by Shia Muslims. Saddam was a Sunni Muslim, and his loyalists were here in central Iraq. And a no-fly zone is a provision where the area is technically under Iraqi control, but Iraq was supposedly not allowed to send warships or planes to bomb in this area. In the Kurdish area here in northern Iraq, the northern fly zone largely was enforced by coalition forces, and Iraqi Kurdistan has basically been independent since 1991. I mean, they're part of Iraq. They participate in Iraqi elections, but there's a degree of very, very significant degree of local autonomy. In the southern no-fly zone, by contrast, the U.S. ultimately is not willing to enforce. They don't want to see U.S. forces essentially come into conflict with Saddam, and a Shiite uprising is repressed, and this has significant long-term consequences on Iraqi politics after the second Gulf War. But the basic approach here, the short approach here with regards to the Gulf War, is that after Iraq invaded Kuwait, Bush put together an incredibly impressive coalition, including former U.S. enemies like China and the Soviet Union, and Syria, and including a wide array of Muslim states, to make it impossible for Saddam to suggest that this was a war of the West against Islam, and that the resulting military campaign succeeded in weakening Saddam's power in Iraq, ensuring that a pro-Western movement in northern Iraq, the Iraqi Kurds, would succeed, and also restoring the independence of Kuwait. And again, maybe another president would have been able to do this, but it was a quite impressive accomplishment. That was the sort of high point. The low point, I think, of Bush 1 and foreign policy is seen on this map. So this is an ethnic map of southeastern Europe in the late 1980s. And you should notice a couple of things here. One is that most of these countries, which at one point, remember I showed a comparable map in an earlier snippet after World War I, most of these countries were ideologically were ethnically all over the place in the 20s. So you would see, in a country like Czechoslovakia, yes, you'd see Czechs here, but you'd also see Germans, and you'd see Hungarians, and you'd see Poles, and you'd see Jews. It was an ethnically heterogeneous area, despite all of this talk about self-determination. This changes during and after World War II. Obviously, the Holocaust leads to the murder of most of the Jews in this region. Most of the survivors after the war will flee to either Israel or to the United States. Meanwhile, there are massive forced population shifts in the aftermath of World War II. So the result is that that what you see, if you look at all of these countries, is that for the most part, they're now ethnically homogeneous. That is, that in the Czech lands, they're basically Czechs. In Hungary, they're Hungarians. In Romania, it's mostly Romanians, except for a small pocket of Hungarians. But then we look at this one country here, Yugoslavia, which remains in place in the late 80s. And you see lots and lots and lots of colors. This is the one part of Eastern Europe that does not have an ethnic purge after World War II. And you can see here how this kind of breaks down multiple provinces of Yugoslavia that all have various minority populations. And then this one province in the middle of the country, Bosnia and Herzegovina, which doesn't even have a majority ethnic group. It's part Bosnian Muslim, part Croat, and part Serb. This country was kept together for dozens of years after World War II by this man, Marshal Tito, a communist partisan who had led the resistance to the Nazis during World War II, and then establishes a one-party state in the aftermath, but one that is not loyal to the Soviet Union either. He says, look, we liberated Yugoslavia, not the Red Army. So the Yugoslav communists are going to remain in control. And Tito rules until 1980 when he passes away. Upon his death, he called for a new constitution. Again, he was the absolute dictator. So if he wanted a new constitution, there'd be a new constitution that would set up 6 provinces: Macedonia, Serbia, Montenegro, Bosnia, Croatia, and Slovenia, and a federal presidency in which a leader from each of these provinces would be the president for 1 year out of 6, and the presidency would then rotate. And his hope was that basically power would devolve from the central government to the provinces, and it would keep the country together. This was a good idea on paper. It winds up not working out, largely because of the machinations of this man, Slobodan Milosevic, who was the head of the Serb Communist Party. This is a photograph of him with his wife and son, who were the term sometimes used in political science is kleptocrats. That is, that they were autocratic leaders, but they really weren't ideologues at all. They were just interested in maximizing profit for themselves from the government. And Milosevic had been a doctrinaire communist through the mid-1980s. He realizes what way the wind is blowing, and after 1987, he reinvents himself as a hardline Serb nationalist. Again, he's just hoping to stay in power. He's seen what's happened next door to Nicolae Ceausescu in Romania, and as part of his new program, he calls for the creation of a greater Serbia in which all Serbs, regardless of whether they're in the Serbian province or not, will be under the control of Serbia. And you can see on the map here, there are significant pockets of Serb population in both Bosnia and Croatia. And the Milosevic rhetoric is basically, look, if we should be able to have all of these lands transferred to Serbia. This rhetoric arouses considerable concern in the other parts of Yugoslavia. And eventually in 1991, first Slovenia, then Croatia, and then around a year later, Bosnia, all pull out of Yugoslavia and declare independence. The result is a civil war in which Milosevic encourages Serb paramilitary forces to work in concert with the Yugoslav army, which is under the control of the Serbs, to liberate Serb territory from Croatia and Bosnia. Slovenia very quickly becomes independent, but the rest of the country runs into problems. The Serbs launch an invasion of Croatia at the depths of the war. Around a third of Croatia was occupied by the Serbs, and in 1992 they launch a similar military campaign against Bosnia, which has just declared its independence, and have a siege of Sarajevo, the capital, where most of the people in the city are Bosnian Muslims, and you have these Serb paramilitary forces on the hills around them. And the Bush administration response to this is basically, this is a European problem. We don't like what Milosevic is doing. We think he's an unsavory character. But who rules Bosnia? Bush argues, is not a concern to us. The Europeans should handle it, and the result is that Milosevic strengthens his position during most of the Bush years. And these are some photos from the Yugoslav Civil War. This is a humanitarian, economic, and moral disaster, and it's a good episode showing the shortcomings of the Bush approach. Bush's argument is that all U.S. foreign policy should be based on this vision of does this policy initiative advance U.S. strategic interests? But what you do when you get to a case like Bosnia and Croatia, where there seems to be a moral justification for the policy, even though there are no significant strategic concerns. Bush's answer to that is you still rely on strategic concerns, even if it's morally uncomfortable. Bush is not reelected, largely for on the economy, is replaced by Bill Clinton, and we'll be looking at Clinton's foreign policy in our third snippet.